I see trees of green.
I haven't got a PowerPoint presentation, but I'll just briefly go over the planning requirements or otherwise with timber production, and then Stuart will outline the code of practice for timber production. I've got a background in sort of planning industry, state government and local government, including our local government here, and also with private work. So I was involved with when they brought in a generic planning scheme for Victoria in the late 1990s. So all schemes operate on the same state policy base and they're generically the same planning scheme, and then councils can adapt them locally as they require. So there is some provisions for timber production that I'll go into. The good news really from a planning point of view, I think everyone here is Murrindindi Shire, aren't they? So I think with the exception of Damien, who's rural living zone, almost certainly everyone's in a farming zone. So under a farming zone, no planning permit is required for timber production on private land if you meet the code of practice for timber production. So it's good news in that sense. There's less regulatory framework. So under the farming zone, things are, you don't require a permit for timber production if it meets the code, but there is a couple of things that would trigger a planning permit. It's if you're within 100 metres of a house in different ownership, 100 metres from a residential, commercial or industrial zone, or 20 metres from a power line. So if people fall outside those few triggers, it's generally quite good news in terms of no permit required. There's a particular provision in the planning scheme relating to timber production, and that has to be met for no planning permit, or if no planning permit is required. Under that provision, the basic part of it is that it needs to comply with the code of practice. It also only kicks in if projects are 5 hectares or greater. So my reading of it is anything on private land below 5 hectares is not subject to any planning control or the code of practice. For local government to demonstrate that it meets the code of practice, there are 2 requirements. Council uses a forest advisor to assist it in terms of assessing proposals, but people need to lodge a plantation notice with council, and at the end they need to lodge a harvesting notice. So in each case, council's forest advisor would check that it meets the code of practice, and if it does, then people can proceed on that basis. With the harvesting notices, there's also a requirement that a before and after is undertaken on the road condition. So where roads are to be used for access for harvesting, council's engineering would look at the condition of that road, and following harvesting would again look at the condition, and theoretically council can then ask people to reinstate the roads if there's any damage associated with that harvesting. As I understand it, it's quite difficult for council to demonstrate that, and there's been no successful cases where they've had to do that in this municipality. Murrindindi is a relatively straightforward process for those considering proposals in other shires. Some other shires have convinced the minister that they require a permit in certain circumstances, and it can only be done for projects greater than 40 hectares or 100 acres. I think those councils in this region are Tawong, Wodonga, Indigo and Alpine. In those areas, they've only convinced the minister that a permit is warranted in very high landscape areas. I personally, in a different life in state government, was involved with this when they were bringing these controls in, and Alpine at that stage wanted to introduce a permit requirement across the whole Shire. And I had to sit in as a regional officer with the Minister for Planning and the local member who wanted the control, and the Minister didn't want the control. So it was quite an interesting process to sort of look at that and observe it. And then obviously the Minister for Planning won, but the government thinking at the time, and I believe it's still the same, is that the less planning control over timber production, the better, and it was only warranted in very special circumstances. As an aside, Strathbogie also has a trigger for a planning permit for production, timber production, and that's east of the, for those considering local projects, it's east of the Murrindindi Road and south of the Hume Highway. So it's up on the Strathbogie Plateau. But in this municipality, it's quite straightforward. Yarra Ranges and Mansfield also trigger the need for permits. Where people need to use the services of Council's Forest Advisor, so he can help with general inquiries, but in particular the two plans that I mentioned. His name's John Moore, and he can be contacted through Council's Planning Department. I spoke to John about this. He was unable to come today, but he sort of reminded me of the vexed issue of whether there should be any planning control over timber production altogether. We've got the minimum requirement where there's no permit subject to the code, but a lot of people in the industry, and I'm sure it still occurs, argue whether it should be under planning at all. And I think the argument is that is timber production any different to cropping or animal production taking place on rural land where it doesn't need to be controlled at all? That's a state government matter, and I don't know what the right answer is there, but it's a question that probably the timber industry will continue to raise. Similarly with the road conditions where there's got to be a before and after from council, there has been arguments there that is the production or is the transport of timber produce any different to any other rural activity? So a stock truck or a grain truck or even timber trucks leaving Crown land. And I did forget to mention the timber code of practice that local government have to demonstrate is met doesn't apply to agroforestry, and it also doesn't apply to Crown land. It'd be ridiculous for local government to try and look at projects that are undertaken on Crown land, which has its own management processes.
Grant and I are a tag team, so we'll take questions after we finish. I'm going to cover some of the same territory. In my job, I'm always required to go back to the primary material. In life, most of us look to the secondary material because it's easy to understand than going to the primary material. But my task generally is to go to the primary material to see if I can find out if what they're saying in the secondary material is right or not. Now, I just wanted to start by making a suggestion as to what you should do if you want to find out what applies to your property. Basically, every municipality has a planning scheme, and in the planning scheme there are zones and there are overlay controls. So a zone might be a farming zone, a rural living zone, residential zone, and then overlays. A property might be the subject of lots of overlays. You might have a significant landscape overlay, a bushfire overlay, a salinity overlay, an erosion overlay, and we need to find out for our property, well, what are the planning controls that apply to our particular property? And then there are particular controls in each planning scheme. For example, there are particular controls over native vegetation removal. There's particular controls over timber production, and we need to consider those. And sometimes planning schemes will incorporate documents, and the Code of Practice for Timber Production is an incorporated document, and that then has effect to the extent that the planning scheme gives it effect. Now, the first step when it comes to an individual property is to search for a planning report. You can go to planning.vic.gov.au, type in your address and download a PDF planning report. And so that's an example for our property at 682 Cathedral Lane. And that'll tell us the zones, the overlays, and tell us how to download a report. And then when we do download the report, we get property details. For this property, we're in a farming zone. There's a schedule, which is like the local variation for the farming zone. We're in a bushfire management overlay, and we're in a significant landscape overlay. And again, we have a schedule providing more details of that. That's in relation to the location near the Cathedral Range. And so this is one way of easily finding out for your property, well, what are the controls? And if you click on the particular things, that'll actually take you to the provisions in the planning scheme. So it's a quick way of finding out the controls. Now, the truth is that it's very complicated, but nonetheless, a good starting point for everyone is to download a planning report in order to ascertain your position. Now, most of you, as Grant has said, will be in the farming zone. Now, the farming zone has as one of its purposes to provide for the use of land for agriculture, and I'll explain what agriculture is in a moment, and it includes timber production. So a farming zone it's one of its purposes intended to be used for timber production. And you'll see that in the table of uses, agriculture is a use for which no permit is required, and there are no conditions that are attached to it. But that excludes timber production. Timber production is referred to separately. And before I go to that though, the way the planning scheme works, it has classifications of use, and then it has sub-classifications, and then it has sub-classifications. So with agriculture, it's divided into animal husbandry, aquaculture and crop raising. And for crop raising, it's divided into horticulture, rice growing, timber production. And so you can see that timber production is a subset of crop raising, which is a subset of agriculture. And the way the planning scheme works is if it refers to agriculture, that includes timber production, unless it specifies that it doesn't include timber production. Now, crop raising is defined as land used to propagate, cultivate or harvest plants, including cereals, flowers, fruit, seeds, trees, turf and vegetables. And timber production is defined as land used to propagate, cultivate, manage and harvest timber. And you can see that what we're mainly talking about here clearly falls within the land use term timber production. Now, typically, in the farming zone, timber production doesn't require a permit, provided these conditions are met. And the first one is it must meet the requirements of clause 53.11, which is a specific set of provisions relating to timber production. And I'll go to that in a moment. The next one is that a council may impose a requirement in a schedule that requires you to get a permit if the timber production is more than a certain area in size. Now in Murrindindi there's none specified, so we don't have to worry about that. And then another condition, as Grant has explained, is if you're within 100 metres of a dwelling, in separate ownership, land zone for other uses, and so forth. Now, the main one, which is relevant to most of us, will be that first one, meeting clause 53.11. Now 53.11, the key aspect of that is sub-paragraph 2, 53.11.2. And this is where the heading is timber production to comply with Code of Practice for Timber Production. So let's just briefly analyse that. It says all timber production activities must comply with the code, but there are exceptions. And those exceptions are agroforestry, windbreaks, and commercial plantations of 5 hectares or less. So there are 3 exceptions. And agriculture is defined as the simultaneous and substantial production of forest and other agricultural products from the same land unit. And I'll say something more about that in a moment. Now, I think that if you can avoid bureaucracy, you should. And hence, if you can come under the exceptions, that's a good thing, because then you are as of right and you don't have to worry about bureaucracy. Hooray! And that's why it's very important to understand those exceptions. Some in government take the view that if your plantation is more than 5 hectares in size, you must comply with the code. That is a misreading of the exceptions. A correct reading of the exceptions, in my opinion, is that there are 3 exceptions: agroforestry, windbreaks, and commercial plantations of 5 hectares or less. I don't think the words 5 hectares or less qualify windbreaks, and they don't qualify agroforestry as a matter of statutory interpretation. Now, assuming the code does apply, then it must be complied with to the satisfaction of the responsible authority. That does not mean you need to tell the responsible authority what you're doing and get their approval before you do it. Rather, it means that you must conduct your affairs in compliance with the code. And if the responsible authority then says, well, we don't think you are, and there is an issue about it, you have to do it the way the responsible authority says. Of course, that would be subject to review in VCAT, so they don't have the final word, but they have an important say in how it's done. But it's not a case where they need to approve step by step as to what you're going to do. Now, going back to this notion of agroforestry, because it seems to me that if you have a plantation more than 5 hectares, and it's not a windbreak, it might nonetheless still be exempt from compliance with the code because it's agroforestry. So what is agroforestry? It's defined as the simultaneous and substantial production of forest and other agricultural products from the same land unit. A land unit, it's not defined, but I think it would mean either the same lot or parcel of lots, if you have a number of lots in the one parcel, provided they manage just the one property. That's what a land unit would normally mean. Agricultural products, that's not defined, but it wouldn't be just livestock. It could be fodder, such as slashing for hay, or it could be crops. It's quite a generic term.
How about some bees?
Bees, it's an agricultural product. It is. Simultaneous at the same time. Substantial production. I think that means it has to be more than token. And so if you're seeking to claim that your forestry is agroforestry, the non-forestry agricultural activity has to be genuine and substantial, not token. And so if you just have one hive of bees, probably not enough. So that's what the word substantial comes in.
Would that cover agistment as well as your own cattle?
Yes, it would. It's the use of the land that counts, not the economic arrangement as between the user and the landowner. It all gets back to how the land is used. And now, I want to now assume that, well, we're still bound by the code, so now I want to talk about the code. But I just wanted to put in a pitch first, because I think many of us would actually be in a position where we're subject of the exceptions and in a position, as Grant explained earlier, that maybe might be thought to be more desirable rather than having to worry too much about the bureaucracy. Now, the Code of Practice started in 1989, and it was, and I was actually involved in advising the government at the time on it, and it was principally directed, in fact solely directed at that time, at the management of state forests. And it was designed to bring some order to the fairly ruthless way in which the state or its licensees manage state forests. And subsequently it was amended in 1993, I think in 1996, 2007, 2014, and we just had some very recent amendments, principally in relation to the state forest portion last year. Interestingly enough, the version that's incorporated into the planning scheme is still the 2014 version. Nothing really turns on it for us, because although there were very substantial changes in relation to state forests, there were really only irrelevant changes to private plantations. Now the Code of Practice for Timber Production imposes quite rigorous rules in relation to forestry on Crown land, state forests. And it also imposes quite rigorous rules in relation to private forestry in native forests. But it has a chapter, Chapter 4, that deals with the rules in relation to timber production on private plantations. And those rules are by and large not rigorous. Those rules apply to plantation design, protecting environmental values, establishment and management of plantations, roading and harvesting. And it's hard to read the slide, but I've just extracted the contents page for Chapter 4 to give you some idea of what it covers. Now, it consists of objectives and mandatory requirements. And normally it's the mandatory requirements that one really focuses on, because that's the things that you have to do if you're required to comply with the code. To a very large extent, the mandatory requirements are expressed in qualitative terms. You should do this, or you must do this if it's practicable, or you must do this provided you minimise impacts. In other words, the vast majority of the requirements, in fact, the vast majority are just common sense that we do anyway, but if there was an argument about it, in the vast majority of cases there'd be plenty of scope to argue both sides. And thus, I don't regard the requirements as particularly onerous, especially having in mind the type of the type of things that it covers, and the very likely probability that the timber producer would do that anyway. For example, not bring a machine within 5 metres of a saturated creek, unless you're building a crossing. Ensuring that when you harvest, you try not to knock down native vegetation. And you only, if you do it accidentally, you clean up as best you can. Protecting the waterways from erosion. They're all things that most timber producers would regard as important and would do anyway. And to the extent that there are requirements in the code, they are by and large things that good minds could differ on as to whether you're actually complying or not. To that end, I don't see it as a major obstacle if you are required to comply with the code. Now, there are a couple of things, as Grant has mentioned, that are, if you like, not just qualitative but actual requirements. One is that there is a provision requiring a plantation development notice to to be lodged with the local government not less than 28 days before the commencement of site preparation. And that notice is not only intended to say who you are and the area to be planted, what's to be planted, but it's also to indicate the native vegetation that exists within your plantation boundaries. Now, the idea of that is essentially to provide a record that you are using that as timber production and thus free you from the obligations in relation to the removal of native vegetation, which I'll be coming to shortly. Interestingly, in my opinion, it doesn't require consideration by the council. They simply need to file it. And it certainly doesn't need the approval of the council. It's not a document that has no effect until it's approved. Rather, it has effect when the notice is given. And that's why I find it very strange when I go into the fees that Murrindindi Council charges, that it actually charges $128 to receive one of these notices. It doesn't take $128 to file it. And I actually think that fee is invalid for other reasons. But it is important that local government know its place according to the law, and the law doesn't require the approval of a plantation development notice, in my opinion. I always add in my opinion because that's the way we do it. Now, the other thing is the harvesting notice, a timber harvesting plan. I think this is over the top because it applies to thinnings. And of course, thinnings might be when your tree's this high. And the concept of having a timber harvesting plan when you're thinning 1,000 stems per hectare to say 300 stems per hectare and you're getting rid of trees 2 or 3 metres high, it's a nonsense. But nonetheless, the way the code is drafted, that would appear to warrant a timber harvesting plan. Now, this plan also requires quite a deal of detail, but in my view, it is not a plan that needs to be approved. Rather, it's a plan which needs to be lodged. It's not the task of the responsible authority to decide whether it's an appropriate plan. Rather, it's the giving of notice so that if the responsible authority seeks to ensure that you're complying with the code, then it has an opportunity to investigate it and take action if it seeks to do so. There is another provision that's relevant in clause 5311. Bear in mind 5311 applies, and this applies regardless of whether you're bound by the code or not. So regardless of whether you're bound by the code or not, there is a provision in clause 5311 that it's the responsibility of the forest owner or manager to restore any roads that were used as a cartage route to the same condition as they were before the commencement of harvesting operations, to the extent of any damage caused as a result of harvesting operations. Now, I think it's arguable, by reason of the wording, that that only kicks in if you comply with the code, but you could argue both ways on that. So let's assume that it applies regardless. It is often the case with some uses, such as quarries, that the quarry owner will have to do a before and after assessment of the road and then be responsible for repairs to the road based on whether the after is worse than the before. This is a similar type of provision, I think that the sensible approach would be to ensure that good records are maintained before usage in order to point out if it is the case that a particular pothole was already there before you commenced operation, or whatever. But that's another provision that one needs to be conscious of. Now, the state government has published a document called Management Guidelines for Private Native Forests and Plantations. This is, if you like, designed to be a user guide to the code of practice. I don't think it adds much in the case of private plantations, but nonetheless, it is there. It is important to note that the document itself stresses that it's merely guidelines, and there's no obligation to conduct your affairs in accordance with those guidelines, and failure to comply with the guidelines doesn't have legal consequences. It doesn't amount to non-compliance with the code. Having said that, it's still a useful document. I'm not seeking to discredit it. It's proper that one has to look at it, but to be truthful, I didn't find that in the case of private plantations, it really added much. In fact, it detracted a little bit because it suggested that if you're over 5 hectares, you must comply with the code, which, as I've already explained, I think is a misreading of the planning controls. Now, I want to say something about other legislation briefly. You've got planning, which incorporates the code, but then you've got other rules, whether they be in relation to fire, native vegetation, power lines, Aboriginal heritage and water. I'm not going to go into those, but one must be always cognizant of the fact that we're a highly regulated state, and there are always things that even the most experienced of us don't always foresee. Now, I want to say something about native vegetation because this has implications. We have statewide native vegetation controls, and we've had these for more than 30 years now. And the essential provision, which is in clause 5217 of all planning schemes, is that a permit is required to remove, destroy or lop native vegetation, including dead native vegetation. And native vegetation is defined as plants indigenous to Victoria. It's not just trees, it could be grasslands, for example. So that's the starting point. Now, importantly, there are lots of exemptions. There are lots of exemptions at the state level, and then there might be exemptions in a schedule, which has local implications. But the one exemption at the state level relates to planted vegetation. And Rowan Reid commented on this the other day. He had a couple of comments, one of which I agree with and one of which I don't agree with. The one I agree with is the fact that he said that the exemption doesn't apply to native vegetation planted or managed with public funding for the purpose of land protection or enhancing biodiversity, unless it's in accordance with the permission of the funder. And he said, well, that doesn't make sense, it's got adverse policy implications, and I agree with him on that. The other exception is native vegetation that is to be removed, destroyed or lopped that was either planted or grown as a result of direct seeding. Now, there's been a couple of cases I'm aware of as to what's meant by planted or grown as a result of direct seeding, in particular focusing on whether if you have a plantation and the plantation trees drop seed, whether or not that is covered by that exception. One case said it was, and another case said it wasn't, and I think the second case is probably correct, but there's another exception which is relevant here, and that's the regrowth exception. Now, the regrowth exception is you don't need a permit if the native vegetation that's to be removed, destroyed or lopped has naturally established or regenerated on land lawfully cleared of naturally established native vegetation and is less than 10 years old, bracken, and this is the important one, within the boundary of a timber production plantation as indicated on a plantation development notice or other documented record and has established after the plantation. So if you have cleared land and you put a timber plantation on it and seeds drop down and new trees grow, like John Woodley's. But instead of John Woodley wanting to make it his new native forest, and I don't believe that's practical, John, but anyway, that's beside the point. The question is, could you actually take one of those trees down for timber? Well, in my opinion, you could. All you would need to show is it's within the boundary of a timber production plantation, and that timber production plantation boundary is either identified in a plantation development notice, which I talked about earlier, or, and it's a good or, in another documented record. And the documented record might well be an aerial photograph showing that it was cleared land, had timber planted on it, and the boundaries of the timber production area are usually pretty obvious from a series of aerial photographs. So I think Rowan probably was a bit conservative in his view, or listened to the wrong person, because in my opinion, if seeds drop from a planted tree in a timber production plantation, I see no reason why it wouldn't be covered by the regrowth exception. When I talked about native vegetation controls, I was talking about the statewide provisions, sort of that are the principal provisions. But you can get other overlays which also control tree removal. Significant landscape overlay, native vegetation overlay, that's more of an urban type control, but sometimes it can be used in rural areas. And unfortunately, the exceptions that are written for those overlays, and they're usually significant exceptions, aren't worded in precisely the same way as the exemptions in the state controls. And it's a matter we should take up with our lawmakers. They ought to be consistent, but to the extent that they are different, if you are the subject of both controls, you have to comply with both, which sometimes means that you think you're okay, but when you check the overlay, you've got to make sure that's okay as well. All right, well, that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Stuart, I have a question with regards to the plantation notice. Is other surrounding landholders who learn about your intention of establishing a plantation, can they potentially lodge an objection if they have concerns? Like in our case, for another tree farm, we had a neighbor on a downstream creek who was concerned that the water yields would be impacted by growing trees in the first 10 to 15 years. Fair enough. We really had to think about this and address this point. And so my question to you is, can other landholders around you, be it for aesthetic reasons or for whatever reasons, lodge their objections?
Answer's no. The more detailed answer is that, as I indicated, a plantation development notice is not an instrument seeking an approval. Rather, it's a notice given from one person to the other in order to bring the other, to bring the information to the other's attention. That's all. Even if the rule was that a plantation development notice had to be approved by the council, even if that were to be the case, which it's not, there still would be no basis for objections. And that's because where a planning requirement is imposed upon a person to the satisfaction of the responsible authority, that's a two-party process.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's no third-party appeal or notification obligations, which are equivalent to, say, an application for planning permit. If there's technically detriment, council can require notification, but this process we're talking about is technical only.
Yes?
So if it's a notice provision only, and say you didn't lodge a plantation notice at the beginning of your process, which we have, but hypothetically if you didn't do it, what's the consequence?
I don't believe there's any consequence of any significance. The main potential consequence would be that it might be said that you haven't planted a forest for timber production, and as a consequence you now need a permit to remove the native vegetation. That's the principal consequence, and that's the principal reason why this notice is required. Its principal reason is to protect the landowner from a suggestion that it wasn't always intended to be harvested. That's the principal purpose. And so that's, I'm not saying you shouldn't give such a notice. If you're bound by the code, you should give such a notice because it actually protects you. And so I don't think there is any consequence. And you'll notice that one of my slides, which I put in here, dealing with native vegetation, was the one about regrowth, and I put in bold the words other documented record. So when it comes to clearing native vegetation that's been planted, but you have not put in a plantation development notice, there's another way of protecting yourself.
Right. So your question, I think, highlights how onerous this is on local government.
Yeah.
Because with state forest, there's obviously experts checking the code, checking their own management practices. With local government, where there is a trigger under planning, with no planning permit subject to the code, most local governments don't have a qualified forester.
Yeah.
So it's particularly hard for them. They've got to then pay for an external advisor, and then it's cost and resource implications for local government.
Sorry, I don't understand. What you lodge it, full stop. Why does it have to be checked?
Well, Stuart's gone into the code, but council is still obliged to say, well, we need a harvesting plan and we need a development notice.
I don't.
But in order, particularly at the harvesting, they need to demonstrate, look, we don't need approval if it meets this, but they don't have the time or the expertise to do it. And I know council's got their own local advisor as a result of Concord above Yark, where it was very complex, and they decided they needed someone to assist them with demonstrating that compliance with the code.
Well, I think this highlights what's a very common problem, and that is that people in government, when they have a concern, think that it has to be regulated. In my opinion, the rules have been deliberately written in a way that eschew regulation but promote information. Enough said.
Can
I
I ask a
think
bureaucratic
also
question?
that Sue McNair could actually not be here today. Unfortunately, for other commitments, she would be terrific because she's bylaws officer and also biodiversity officer, and she deals with the entire question of native vegetation removal and offset planting that we all have to engage in for having a look at the bigger picture in our Shire. What do we want to achieve in terms of biodiversity goals for this Shire? And that would have been good to know her view on that, but I think she will come to the Otways, and I think we should pick her brain as well, or if you have questions, that we ask her as well on her opinion.
I think to myself, what a wonderful